Assalamu alaikum. This is the first of a series of presentations on continuous suture patterns. Continuous sutures are useful to save time and save suture material, but perhaps more importantly, it also distributes the tension across the entire suture line when this is required. There are issues, however, with continuous sutures, in that the entire integrity of the suture line depends on two knots, one at the very beginning, the anchoring suture knot, and one at the very end, the final tie. Continuous sutures are formed up of units of sutures that move continuously between one level and the other. These units are formed up mostly of either horizontally orientated or vertically orientated patterns. Sometimes there is a mix, a hybrid between the two. So for example, the simplest form of continuous sutures, the pattern goes on from 2 to 3 and from 4 to 5 and from 6 to 7 diagonally on the surface and horizontally in the tissues. The first suture, the anchoring suture, goes horizontally between 1 and 2. Here you tie the knot and then you repeat these units afterwards until the very end, where you change direction and finalize the suture line. So basically, continuous sutures are formed up of these three elements: the anchoring stitch, the continuous pattern, and the final knotted stitch. In this presentation, we'll go through the anchoring stitch of various patterns of continuous sutures. We'll go through this 7 different forms of continuous sutures: the simple continuous suture, the interlocking, and the intradermal, and also the 4 sutures that are commonly used for repairing a lumen, for example the pharynx, like the Cushing, which engages the submucosa but does not pass through the mucosa of the viscera, the Connell, that can pass through the lumen of the viscera through the mucosa, the Utrecht, which is basically a modified version of the Cushing, and the Lampart, which is a modified version of the vertical matrix suture. The Parker curve is another type of suture. It is basically a combination of a Cushing at one layer and a Lampart at the other. We'll start with the simplest form of the continuous sutures, in which you anchor your suture by doing a simple suture right at the apex of the wound edge, right at the very top of the wound edge, going from one side to the other in a simple suture pattern. And then you try and place the knot on one side of the wound edge, secure the knot, and then you trim the shorter of the 2 strands, and then you pass from this level to the next by going diagonally across the wound edge. The passage of the needle through the tissue would be in the horizontal level, where you will see that the suture line is actually going diagonally from level 1 to level 2, and this will be repeated all through the suture line after this. So this is the simplest form. The lock stitch, the Ford interlocking, or the blanket suture for short, is very similar to the simple continuous pattern, with only one single difference that I'm going to show in a second. You start in the same way with a simple suture at the very top of the wound edge, and then you tie and you secure your knot on one side of the wound edge before going to the next level. Now you go to the next level, again a simple suture, horizontal, but this time you want to pass the needle through the loop of the suture line, through this loop of suture line, and by this you interlock it. And this distributes the tension across the wound line in a better way. So that's the single difference. You get it out, you get it inside the loop rather than outside the loop as in the simple suture. To anchor the subcuticular stitch of the intradermal suture, you need to pass the needle in the subcutaneous tissue to fix it there, and then tie the knot in there. So the suture now is fixed to the subcutaneous tissue and anchored there. And then you go on and trim the shorter of the two strands. And now you want to retrieve the needle back to the proper plane of the subcuticular or the intradermal suture by bringing the needle into the subcuticular plane in the upper part of the dermis, right at the apex of the wound. This is where you are going to start your suture afterwards, from the subcuticular plane right at the apex of the wound, where you have the suture line knotted securely to the subcutaneous tissue. The Cushing and the Connell sutures are almost identical, except that the Connell suture would pass through the mucosa into the lumen, whereas the Cushing would not pass through the mucosa. And they are, both of them are just a modified horizontal matrix suture with a continuous pattern. So you start at the just below the apex of the wound, but you go beyond the apex on the other side of the apex of the wound, and then return back after changing the needle direction, and this is how you form the first horizontal matrix suture in there. And it is modified in the sense that the strands of the sutures that are on the surface are actually going perpendicular to the wound rather than parallel as the conventional horizontal matrix. But this configuration will bring about inversion of the wound edges, which is required if you are suturing a closed viscera or doing a pharyngoplasty, for example. So you form the first horizontal matrix suture. Again, you trim the shorter of the two strands, and you just go on repeating that unit, the horizontal matrix sutures, by having the bites through the tissue parallel to the wound edge, and the sutures going and on the surface across the wound edge, like perpendicular to the wound edge. So you have one bite on this surface, cross and go to the other surface and repeat. And now you have the loop of the sutures on the surface going perpendicular to the wound, and this is going to cause inversion of the wound edge. The Utrecht stitch is quite similar to the Cushing and to the Connell in that they are basically modified horizontal matrix sutures, modified to invert the wound edges, and they are continuous units of horizontal matrix sutures. The slight difference is that you pass the needle here diagonally from near the wound edge to far the wound edge outside the apex, return back from far outside the apex to near, and you form the first horizontal matrix unit, but it's not a rectangle, it's much like a trapezoid type with two parallel suture lines both perpendicular to the wound edge. You cut the shorter of the two and then you repeat the pattern again. You start here far to the wound edge and then come near. So this is again a diagonal, and you do the same on the other side from the far to the near. So that's another diagonal. And you just keep repeating this. This trapezoid form of suture line would actually distribute the tension in a better way. The Lampart suture is a modified vertical matrix suture, again modified to invert the wound edges, doing for repairing of pharynxes and intestines and stomachs and viscera. And this continuous form of it would start with the anchoring stitch. You start from near to far on one side, reverse the needle and go to the other side and do from far to near. So this is a vertical matrix orientation, a modified vertical matrix I should say. And then when you tie this, you have two loops of suture lines. The larger is more superficial, that's why you end up inverting the wound edge. Hopefully the smaller of the loops will be buried under the larger one, and then you continue doing the same thing after trimming one side of the suture. You just go from near to far on one side and then reverse the needle and repeat it far to near on the other side, and you will have suture strands on the surface of the wound perpendicular to the wound edge, and this is going to cause inversion of the wound edge. So this is basically the different types of anchoring stitch and the starting stitch that you would use with different patterns of continuous sutures. Assalamu alaikum.